त्रिनयनां माणिक्यमौली स्फुरत् तारानायकशेखरां स्मितमुखीमां मीनवक्षोरुहां पाणिभ्यामलिपूर्णरत्नचषकं रक्तोत्पलं बिभ्रतीं घटस्थरक्तचरणां ध्यायेत् परामम्बिकाम्
Namaste and a warm welcome to each one of you for joining us on the 17th day of the festival, the Global Festival of Yoga, being organized and offered by Indica Yoga with many other partner collaborating institutions joining in. Today we have with us Dr. Ganesh Mohan ji. Ganesh Mohan ji, may I request you to kindly come on the screen?
One moment, just adjusting my mic. Here we are.
Swagatam, Ganesh ji.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have been thinking about it, and we really feel blessed to have wonderful teachers coming in daily, every day, at least 3 sessions a day. I mean, we just not be thankful enough for what the universe has offered us. And today we have Ganesh Mohanji with us. Ganesh Mohanji is a very well-known, world-renowned teacher in the tradition of Krishnamacharya yoga tradition. Uh, Everyone knows him, but just I like to give a formal introduction to him. Dr. Ganesh Mohan learned yoga from childhood in the tradition of Sri Krishnamacharya through his parents, his father being one of the long-time personal students of the master. As most of you know, he is the son of Sri A.G. Mohan and Indra Mohan. Mohanji was the first person, one of the first students of Krishnamacharya, or a long-term students of Krishnamacharya from nearly 1971 to 1989. For nearly 2 decades, Mohanji had a very close association with Krishnamacharya ji. In fact, in one of the books of A.G. Mohanji, that is the Yoga for Body, Breath and Mind, Krishnamacharya ji writes a very fond foreword and he praises him highly of what he has learned and what he has achieved. That is Mohanji for us. And Ganesh ji is a son of Mohanji and Indraji, under whom he started his training. He is also trained in other ancient studies, including Sanskrit, Vedic chanting, and Ayurveda in the traditional way, and then went on to become a modern medical doctor. He integrates ancient and modern well-being methods, directing the Svastha Yoga and Ayurveda trainings. Svastha Yoga and Ayurveda is a foundation that has been started by Mohanji and Indra Mohanji, and now Ganeshji and Nityaji are also part of it. And Ganeshji leads the Svastha Yoga Therapy Programs across the globe. He is the co-author of numerous books published internationally, including Yoga Therapy, Krishnamacharya, his life and teachings, Yoga Yajnavalkya, it's a translation, and Yoga Reminder, and also Hatha Yoga Pradipika, another translation. These are some of his books. He is well known through his teachings, his courses that are being offered online, and he has students across the world. And the very fact that he was able to take some time off and be with us is indeed a very, very uh, encouraging and also a blessing that we have received. With this brief introduction, I request Mohanji Ganeshji to take over from this point onwards. And I also would like to welcome all our participants who've joined from across the globe. And just to add, for whatever questions you'd like to share, please put them up in the Q&A box and we will be able to take them up at the end of the session. Mohanji, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Vinay Chandra. Thank you. I will begin with the simple peace chant Sahana Vavatu, asking for harmony in the studies, a universal prayer, not to any particular deity, could be to whichever deity, the universe that you prefer, to ask benevolence, well-being, goodness from. Let our studies be filled with energy. Let there be no misunderstanding between teacher and student. May we progress together. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Welcome to all of you, and many thanks to Indica Yoga for making this festival happen. Most of us are stuck indoors for the last couple of months, and some of us have the opportunity to be outdoors more now. But this may have been a life-changing time for many of us. The traditional goal of yoga is called Kaivalya, which derives from the root to be alone. Literally, the goal of yoga is to be alone, which is not social isolation in the sense that we are talking about now, but to have awareness, consciousness, our inner presence be just as itself, without all the thoughts, emotions, sensations, experiences that normally come and go in our mind, in our senses, in our bodies, interfacing with our inner presence. Rather, we experience the purity of just being present. That is Kaivalya. The pathway to that is long and not so easy, because first we need to consider, why do we want to do that at all? Now, though the goal of yoga is presented as Kaivalya, actually the statement of the purpose of yoga is a little different. Patanjali in the Yoga Sutra says, Heyam Dukkham Anagatam. The purpose of yoga is to be free of dukkha. Dukkha is simply translated as suffering, a negative state. Kham means space. The space inside of us is not okay. For many of us, these last few months may have been challenging, partly because of external circumstances and partly because of internal circumstances. The joke goes, many long for eternity who don't know what to do with themselves on a rainy Sunday afternoon. If we are cut off from our sources of entertainment, distraction, the activities that normally fill our lives, we are forced to look within us. What is happening in my body, in my senses, and deeper inside in my mind? Is that a comfortable space to be in? Is your inner space a comfortable place for you to live in? The path of yoga is about creating an inner space that is pleasant, stable, and calm, no matter what happens outside. This journey is no different now than from what it was a few thousand years ago. I'm going to share with you a little presentation that I customized for this lecture. See, we all want skills for well-being, and that's why we see this self-help industry booming in recent times. There are books on self-help on just about every aspect of body, mind, and recently breathing. How to develop positive emotions, how to develop willpower, how to get rid of back pain, how to get out of depression, and so on. But you know what? It doesn't seem to be working all that well. The burden of chronic disease is not decreasing. In the last 100 years, we have done some amazing things with technology, and that has spilled over into medicine. 100 years ago, you had very little guarantee, for example, of going into anesthesia and coming out safely. Surgical techniques, antibiotics, we have access to wonderful tools of healthcare now that we could have barely dreamed of 100 years ago. That works extremely well when the problem is circumscribed, meaning that there is a clear cause for the distress, for the health problem. And if we can tackle that cause and that mostly removes the health problem, then modern medicine does a fantastic job. But you take a problem like anxiety, I mean, just look at this name, generalized anxiety disorder. What does that mean as a diagnosis? It's not really telling you anything much about the problem. It's just a description of the symptoms that people are in general suffering from anxiety. And you can have a list of symptoms that you place under this diagnosis. How do you manage to reduce anxiety? Now, that doesn't come out clearly from the diagnosis. In fact, for most chronic health problems, this is the case. It's easy to change our surroundings, but unless we change ourselves, managing chronic disease is very difficult. Consider, for example, back pain. We have this beautiful diagnosis called non-specific back pain. It's not really a diagnosis in the sense that it's not pointing us to any particular cause. It is actually saying that we are not able to find a cause for your back pain. Some 80% of back pain falls under this heading. What is the cause of non-specific back pain? The answer is there is no single cause. Instead, there are lots of variables. A lot of variables are involved in creating this experience you call chronic pain. Your thoughts about your back, the emotions you feel about it, the way you're sitting throughout the day, which is an increasing risk factor the last few months, the type of exercise you do, the occupational hazards, what type of movements do you repeat through the day, how is your stress level, how is your inflammation, which ties into your diet. All of these are related to chronic pain. So when you give a diagnosis of back pain, what does it really mean for the treatment? Are we saying that this person needs to focus on changing their posture, or that they need to change their mind, or they need to change the way they eat? It depends. Depending on that individual, each of these factors may be more or less important in contributing to the back pain. Modern medicine, unfortunately, is not very good at dealing with this kind of a situation where there are lots of variables and a long-term trajectory of the problem. The problem builds over time with many variables. Our challenge in modern times is to find a balance between these two. We have focused a lot on controlling our environment using technology. And maybe that is not always a good thing. I will just take a little side road into a little anecdote here. I was once in Dayton, Ohio, in the Midwest in the United States. That area is where the Wright brothers apparently made their first test flights. They were the people, at least in public knowledge, to have shown that heavier than air flight was possible. So the United States Air Force has their national museum there. It's a really interesting place to walk through, where you can see the entire history of the development of technology of flight. So they have full-scale models of the earliest planes, and the early planes, which is about 100 years ago, look like they're rickety, looking from a modern perspective. They're made of wood and cloth. It looks like they can barely fly with a little motor that has less power than your car. But you look at what happens in just 10 years and what happens in 30 years in the span of just one generation, and you have a very modern looking plane. But why did this development take place? Because of World War I and II. When I wandered through this museum, initially the technology was fascinating. It was really interesting to see. But as I continued to go through the exhibits, I was filled with a sense of sadness. What was all this effort that we had made 100 years ago into creating the capacity for flight? all this effort into creating this wonderful technology because each of these planes is a bomber. Along with the plane, you have a display of the guns that were mounted on it and their capacities to create destruction. We have been really good at changing the environment outside in the last century. Technology feeds on itself. Our capacities have increased in leaps and bounds, but that doesn't mean that we have made progress in changing ourselves. And suffering does not come from outside alone. Sankhya, a few thousand years ago, starts with this point that dukkha comes from different sources. Dukkha comes from the environment. Suffering comes from the environment outside, from inanimate consequences, which we still don't control. It comes from other living beings. Consider what has happened in the last few months. And it also comes from within us. We can't control what happens outside, but we can change what happens inside of us. And that is the science of yoga. Well-being requires knowledge. It requires skills. We need a holistic framework because there are many variables involved in well-being. Problems like back pain and depression seem so difficult to tackle nowadays because there are so many variables involved in them. We need a holistic system. You have heard this word many times, I think, in a lot of presentations. Without detail, however, this is not so useful. So what is holistic? You need a map. I'm going to take you back quickly to the ancient system of Yoga, Ayurveda, Sankhya, which are related also to Nyaya, one of the important Vedic darshanas. These foundations underlie all of the Eastern approaches. Nyaya says, Dravya guna karma samanya vishesha samavaya abhavaha sapta padarthaha. This universe consists of 7 categories. I'm going to pick only 3 here. One is dravya, objects. Quite literally, all the things that we see around us. They have guna, qualities, and kriya, functions. A guna is the state of the world or an object. Say you pick up something, say here is a mouse, you see in front of me here. This is an object. It has certain characteristics. It is hard, a side of it is rough to touch. That is the state of the object. Some qualities that are consistently present. There are functions. The object can do something. It has the capacity to create some changes. Now, an inanimate object like this, the functions don't seem to be intrinsic to it, but an animate object, one that has consciousness, is constantly active. Functions are constantly part of the system. Your body, your mind is constantly changing. There is no time when the functions of the body and mind stop. Ultimately, what is reality? Reality is just perceiving guna and kriya, qualities and functions in the world around you. That is a much deeper discussion. What is the nature of existence? How do you know the world exists? The simple answer is you actually don't. All you have is subjective experience. Modern science also completely agrees on this. There's some very interesting connections to the challenges that quantum physics has run into about the role of the observer or measurement. What is the state of the universe if it is not measured? But that's a different discussion. Let's not go there now. For health and well-being, Ayurveda and yoga approach it like this. They take a list of qualities and functions that they consider important and they group them. For example, Ayurveda has a basic list of 10 qualities. This list is from the famous text Ashtanga Hridaya. But all the Ayurveda texts have a list like this, which the qualities may be slightly different, but mostly they are the same. Guru Manda Himasnigdha Shlakshna Sandra Mridusthiraha Gunaha Sa Sukshma Vishadaha Vimshatihi Sa Viparyayaha. A list of 10 qualities on the left side: heavy, slow, cold, oily, slimy, dense, soft, static, subtle, and their opposites on the other side. Balance in these qualities is health. If these are out of balance, that is ill health. This is the basic premise of Ayurveda. And they take these qualities and they classify them like this under three categories. You have all probably heard of this Vata, Pitta, Kapha. These are the three doshas. What are these three doshas? Historically, they've been called humors or energies. Those words are a bit archaic. They are misleading. A better way to understand these are patterns or tendencies. What Ayurveda is saying is, you see the list of characteristics or the qualities, the guna and the kriya, the qualities and functions under Vata, dry, light, cold, clear, mobile, subtle, rough. Ayurveda is saying that these tendencies tend to go together. They have a propensity to cluster. It's an insight into the structure of the human system, about how the human system works, the structure and the function, that the qualities under Vata tend to go together, the qualities under Pitta tend to occur together, and the qualities under Kapha tend to occur together. And these three are types of patterns that determine the trajectory over time of how your body and secondarily your mind behave. That tendency, that pattern is what you call an Ayurvedic constitution of Prakriti. This is a very deeply insightful and a beautiful way of understanding how the body and mind function. You see, different systems of well-being have different lists of qualities. You take Chinese medicine, it is also similar in one sense, but it has slightly different sets of qualities, lists of qualities and functions, and slightly different groupings. All systems of well-being have to come to this sooner or later. They need to have lists of qualities and functions, and they need to put them together in a map. If you don't pick the right qualities and functions to address for your particular problem, it's going to be very difficult to fix it. So this is the challenge as a yoga teacher or as a holistic therapist. When someone comes to you with back pain, what you're doing is assessing which guna and kriya is out of balance. You may do this from an Ayurvedic lens, looking at these qualities and functions that you had listed here. You may also do this from other lenses. Now, I'm going to present to you a quick run through of a way of looking at this guna and kriya as a map. Look at this. You can always look at the playback later. It will be on YouTube. Look at this, for example. This is one way of classifying the qualities and functions that exist in your body and mind. I have put them under 12 areas. I put them under 12 areas mainly because these areas are relatively independent. The skills that happen under one of them are not the same as the skills that happen in the other. There is always overlap, but they have a distinct nature. For example, look at number 3, balanced emotions. There are certain skills to work with positive emotions. If you look at Buddhism, you have a lot of emphasis on metta bhavana, loving kindness. The same occurs in the Yoga Sutra, Maitri bhavana. Karuna is kindness, karuna bhavana. If you practice those, you will find that the opposite emotions, such as anger, begin to fade away, and you become more calm and balanced. This is the Yoga Sutra, first chapter, 33rd Sutra. Maitri karuna mudita upekshanam sukha dukkha punya punya vishayanam bhavanataha chitta prasadanam. That skill of working with your emotions has its own pathway. You need to understand how to do that, how to practice gratitude, how to practice compassion, how to practice love, how to practice forgiveness, how to stay grounded when doing these practices. When compassion is misplaced, like Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita suddenly feels compassion for his enemies in the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita, that is misplaced. So there is a system about how to practice the skills of balancing your emotions, which is not the same as how to move well. The skills you need to balance your emotions are not the same as the skills you need in order to move well. Both of them are important for your well-being, isn't it? They are related, of course. How you feel towards your body influences your body, and how your posture and your movement is influences your emotions. But each of these is a domain that has its own special characteristics, its own skills. If you go through these 12 areas and you begin to develop skills under each of them, and mind you, a lot of this is there in the ancient systems. That's my point. Yoga itself, along with Ayurveda, contains suggestions and lists of gunas and kriyas to work with most of these areas. But more importantly, yoga is the container, it's the map that allows you to bring in more skills whenever you want. The challenge that we face is to find the skills to work on and to do them consistently over time. That is where a teacher, a guidance, a system of learning is useful. For example, consider the domain of moving well. Yeah, I know this looks like a lot, but it isn't actually. If you just start systematically and develop these skills little by little, in just say 1 year, you will find that you're moving so much better all the time. Asana is the most common phase of yoga nowadays. What is asana? Patanjali says, Sthira Sukham Asanam Prayatna Shaithilya Ananta Samapattibhyam Tatodvandva Anabhigataha. 3 sutras. Asana is a pathway to a change in bhava, the state of experience you have of your body. Am I stable? Am I comfortable? And the key skills to do that are working with effort, relaxation, and connection to the body. Patanjali is laying out the kernel, the seed of a map. And there are a few other keys in the first chapter also about how to work with the body. We can expand on this map quite easily by adding more guna and kriya to this. Am I aware of my body or am I unaware? See, when it comes to yoga therapy, your approach becomes much simpler and clearer if you look at it as teaching the person skills for well-being rather than looking at the diagnosis from the modern medical perspective first. I was looking at a book on yoga and stroke. Now, it's a nice book. Over the years, I look across a lot of the literature in these fields. There has to be an underlying system, that ties together everything. We are all in the same field trying to do the same thing. It's important that we come together with a kind of a universal platform. That platform is guna and kriya, lists of skills that we are teaching our student. You consider what happens when you have a stroke. Some part of the brain loses blood supply because of either a hemorrhage or an aneurysm or atherosclerosis. The blood vessel is blocked. That part of the brain begins to die, and as a result, we begin to lose function in some part of the nervous system. What can you do about that with yoga? You cannot do anything directly to the blood vessel that is inside the brain. That is not what yoga does for you. Instead, yoga teaches us the skills that we are lacking. For example, if the arm is spastic, we teach the person to reconnect to the arm and begin to move it. Now, that skill of moving the arm is not specific to a person with a stroke. No matter what the underlying problem is, if the person finds it difficult to move the arm, here is a key statement. If you find it difficult to move your arm, how are you going to learn to move your arm better? Here is the key statement. You're going to learn to move it better by trying to move it. You're going to learn to move your arm better by trying to move your arm. It's never going to move unless you try to move it. That's how you develop function, by practicing the function. The body learns, adapts. Suppose a person who has had a stroke has weakness in the leg, finds it difficult to stand, gait is uncoordinated. How do you get that person to walk more comfortably? Again, here's the simple answer: by getting them to try walking. Now, this sounds simple, and on one hand it is. So what you are doing in yoga is learning the skill of teaching the person to recover the capacity to walk. So if you say they have weakness in the leg, you can follow a simple step-by-step skill development pathway. Start by feeling your feet on the ground, move your toes, place a little more weight on your feet, shift your weight back and forth on your heels, do a mini squat, take support from a chair, then do a mini warrior, one leg a little in front. I mean, you get the idea. Step by step, there is a little pathway. If someone had multiple sclerosis, what you might do if they had weakness in the leg is not very different. There are some differences based on the disorder, but a lot of the skill development pathway remains approximately the same. A great deal of what we think of as different yoga styles and different yoga traditions is just picking different gunas and kriyas, emphasizing different gunas and kriyas. In some styles of yoga, we choose to stay static for a longer duration. In some, we choose to move more. They're just different skills. It's not that one is bad or wrong and the other is right and good. There are times when your body benefits from staying still. There are times when your body benefits from moving. You should have the skill of doing both. Then you will be well in the long run. Should you always raise your arms like this from the sides, or should you always raise your arms like this from the front? Hey, sometimes you should do it from the side, sometimes from the front, because your body is meant to do both. Do some movement exploration. Learn to balance on one leg because you're going to need it sooner or later. So if you look at these skills and organize them into maps, here is a useful way to understand it. You can look at them like a landscape. What we mean by this is, you look at the 8 limbs of yoga: yama niyama asana pranayama pratyahara dharana dhyana samadhaya ashtau angani, the 8 limbs of yoga. They are like a landscape, meaning that you don't have to start with the yamas necessarily. You can start with the asana and then continue practicing the yamas, deepen the yamas as you practice asana, or you can start by doing breathing techniques and pranayama, or you can start with meditation, dharana, dhyana, samadhi. But eventually, you are going to have to learn to do all of them. This is one of the reasons why yoga is so accommodative, so beautiful. Start anywhere. Eventually, you can pick up all the skills you need. You don't get away, however, with ignoring one of these areas. We cannot say, I just practice asana and pranayama, I don't practice the yamas. That doesn't work. Or I just practice the yamas and I ignore asana and pranayama. It's not likely to work effectively. Well-being and self-transformation is likely to be limited. You don't have to perfect one limb to practice the other. Think of it like a landscape where you need to journey to all of these places and develop skills in all of them. Another way to understand this is like a hierarchy. Mind you, this is there in the Yoga Sutra commentaries itself. I'm not making this up. The 8 limbs are like a ladder. There is also value to starting from the yamas and considering that you go step by step towards dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, which is why Krishnamacharya, my father, used to say that when the Hatha Yoga Pradipika says, Hatasya prathamangatvat asanam purva muchyate, I am starting by describing asana because it's the first limb of Hatha Yoga. Krishnamacharya used to say, doesn't matter, even if it is Hatha Yoga, the first limb is always ahimsa. You cannot practice Hatha Yoga by hurting your body. That's not going to work. Another way to consider it is like this: from outward to inward, from more gross or obvious to more subtle. This is very important to the Eastern pathways, where we go from external experiences to internal experiences. This is not so common in the modern psychological pathways, but in the Eastern pathways, this is key. Now, in modern science, we tend to think of the hierarchy of organization as our framework of approach to well-being. This creates a lot of problems actually in yoga research, also in well-being research in general, because this model is not ideal when you have a complex, emergent, multivariable problem like depression or back pain. See, what modern science tends to think of you as being is this, what's on this slide here. There are atoms which then organize themselves evolutionarily over long billions of years. We have DNA and RNA, and then they encode information, which is then translated into proteins, and then the proteins, along with other molecules, form the little organelles. Your ribosomes, Golgi bodies, endoplasmic reticulum, all that stuff inside your cells. And then there is the entire cell, and then the cells are joined together to form tissues. Tissues form organ systems, and then the nervous system has increasing complexity. So you have emotions, and as the nervous system grows even bigger, we have this big frontal lobe, you have abstract thinking, and then eventually self-awareness. Sankhya kind of thinks of it in a different way. Sankhya puts this like this. This may look slightly confusing, but you can look at it again later. That there is consciousness, which is the foundation of existence. This is the subjective approach. And then from that comes ahankara, which is the I sense. And then the I sense owns all the experiences that you have. And through the tanmatras, the root of sensory experiences, the world arises for you. This is the other way of looking at reality, that it's not atoms that constructed your consciousness. Consciousness gave the opportunity for the world to organize itself into the experiences that you have right now. I repeat that. It's not that atoms came together and then consciousness is an emergent phenomenon from the type of organization, which could also be true. In fact, that is not necessarily in conflict with this. But this is the other way of considering it, that the presence of consciousness gives the opportunity for the organization of the universe to happen surrounding your awareness, which in turn gives rise to the experiences that you have. These are not contradictory. That is very important to realize. I have a whole bunch of things that I probably may not have time to get into, but I just put together more than we might need in case I have the opportunity to show you. You can have an organization of skills for well-being also in the form of a hierarchy, which you do as a yoga teacher or as a therapist. You start by thinking, where should this person start? You build a ladder of skills for them. If you look at skills for breathing, I showed you a list of skills for movement earlier. This is a simple list of skills for breathing. Approximately, this is an order. You don't want to teach a person number 10, bandhas in asana and inversions. You don't want that person doing Uddiyana bandha in headstand. If they cannot first do comfortable awareness of the breath, steady breath, relax and release the breath, do 2, 3, and 4. Generally speaking, there is an order of skill development also. And there is also the subtlety of the experience developing. You can feel your breath, and you can feel your breath more subtly and more subtly and more subtly, and eventually you will land up with the inner body experiences that Hatha Yoga talks about. Nadi, prana, chakras, kundalini, and so on. These three types of mapping should be distinguished. When you have a problem like back pain or depression, you cannot analyze it purely from this y-axis, this ladder of hierarchy or dependencies. Look, this is the reason why antidepressants cannot be a complete solution to depression ever. It's because of the way your system, your body and mind are constructed. Sure, serotonin levels may be depleted in some of your neural circuits when you have depression, but depression is not just a lack of serotonin. Depression is a complex emergent experience where the environment outside, your relationships, your thoughts and emotions, your body posture, everything plays into that experience. The molecule that you see is much further down this ladder. It's somewhere down at the level of proteins, organelles, and cells, and therefore its impact on a layer much higher up is quite non-specific. For instance, consider the neurotransmitter dopamine. Have you heard of this rather ridiculous thing called a dopamine fast, which is the Silicon Valley's idea of repackaging ancient wisdom? Because dopamine is considered to be a molecule that is secreted when you have rewarding experiences. Some parts of the brain use dopamine as a neurotransmitter in circuits of reward. But dopamine is also used in lots of other parts of the brain. For example, when you have Parkinson's disease, a part of your brain has a lack of dopamine in its circuits in the basal ganglia. What happens if you give people dopamine? They have a lack of dopamine in those circuits when they have Parkinson's disease. So let's feed them dopamine. You may find that they may have nightmares and hallucinations, because dopamine is also related to those circuits in the brain. It can trigger psychosis if the person is predisposed to it. You see that dopamine molecule is quite non-specific. It is used in many parts of the brain. What function it serves at a higher level of emergent function depends on which circuit the dopamine is operating in. You can't fix depression by simply giving people a molecule, because depression doesn't arise from a single molecular cause. It is a complex emergent phenomenon from a whole lot of different variables. So you need to also look at it with this x-axis model. You need to look at all of these areas. When we work in yoga, we are not directly influencing some of these lower levels. These lower levels in the level of molecules are accessible through other measures if you're a doctor prescribing medication. Conversely, as a doctor prescribing medication, you don't have access to some of the higher level functions that we work with in yoga. This is very important to understand. I'm going to show you a different screen. You look at this, for example, this is the same thing. These are all notes from a lot of different programs I've done in different places. Just pulled them together quickly yesterday. The same idea you see here up to organ systems. When you're working with yoga, you're generally working at the organ system level and above, which is why it is difficult to do an asana that affects, for example, only your liver. I mean, your liver is here under the right part of your rib cage and extending a little further down. Yes, you can do some twists, you can do certain movements, you can do some breathing that generally works on that area, but that's also somewhat non-specific. You can work on that area, but it's not like you can say, I work exactly on these cells in the liver. Yoga isn't like that. However, yoga is quite specific at the higher levels. What type of movement, what emotion, what sensation, what thoughts, what visualization are you doing, the self-awareness, and all of these, you can't tackle them using medication, but you can tackle them using yoga. This distinction is very important to understand, because scope of practice is crucial to be clear of what we are doing. So coming back, I'm going to quickly run through this. You can take each of these areas, for example, the first one, habit and change in these domains, and look at the skills under them. How do you make a positive change? There are ancient models for it. Kriya Yoga. This is not the modern Kriya Yoga. I'm referring to Patanjali's Kriya Yoga. The second chapter of the Yoga Sutra starts with this Kriya Yoga. You see, yoga is stillness. That's how Patanjali begins the definition, yogaha chittavritti nirodhaha. But how do you transition from actions to stillness? You must do actions that lead you to stillness, which is a bit of a paradox, which is what Kriya Yoga is about. And this is how they traditional commentaries presented. Swami Hariharananda's commentary, Bhaswati, says, Kantakena Kantakodharavate. Like you have a thorn and you remove it using a thorn. You have a little splinter in your foot, like a little thorn, and you use something sharp to bring it out. This impulse to action is in us, and we are restless all the time. You have to allow yourself to do something, but what you do should lead you towards stillness. This Kriya Yoga is actually a beautiful little template for getting us started on the keys for change. The first is tapas. Whatever positive change you do, you're going to face resistance from your past patterns. If you want to do asana, you might feel lazy. If you wish to do pranayama, you might find that you want to check your messages. If you wish to do meditation, I don't even need to get into that. So many thoughts come into the mind and distract us. We don't have to fight with the mind, don't fight with the body, don't fight with the breath, but learn to tolerate a little bit of that discomfort from saying, I am going to persevere. That is called tapas. Tolerating the discomfort that arises during the practices of yoga that make us more sattvic. That practice itself is a different limb. Asana is asana. Asana is not tapas. But persevering, even though there is some resistance to that, that perseverance is tapas. But blind perseverance will be a problem. So you need to have models and frameworks for reflection. That is Swadhyaya, Moksha Shastra Adhyayana. Study and have guidance about frameworks and models that will take us towards stillness. My phone is on silent and it is still ringing. But no matter what effort we make, we can change only so much. So accept Ishvara Pranidhana. I do my best, I leave the rest. You can expand on this with some more simple keys. Look at this, for example. Look at your motivations. Are they more internal to you or external? If you can find more internal motivations, that is good. For example, you wish to exercise. Maybe you should exercise because it makes you feel better in your body, not because somebody else is telling you to exercise. That is an intrinsic motivation. Can you align the change with your values and your purpose? Do you see yourself as a person who exercises? That helps. Take small steps. If you're going to start exercising, start by just taking a small walk, 5 minutes. As long as you're able to do that consistently and you don't fall back, you're on your way. Build support systems. Are there friends, family who are going to help you on this process of change? Be flexible. Some days you won't be able to exercise for this half an hour that you decided on. Maybe you will do 15 minutes that day. It's okay. Allow for speed bumps. There will be setbacks. Maybe there will be a whole week or a month where you did not exercise. It happens. Accept that. Come back. Change your dialogue about your change. Have positive dialogue. Have realistic dialogue about the change. This, for example, is a list of skills that can be implemented very easily as a yoga teacher with your student or client, and as you, as a student who is wanting to change, by just going through this list and then picking one item under each. So this brings me to the end of my presentation for now. The challenge for us in yoga nowadays is to look beyond so much of the information that we are getting and learn how to organize it. Nowadays, I tell people this, you have a great teacher with you always, not the ancient ones, that's always there, but you have something called YouTube. You wish to learn a form of exercise, it's available on YouTube. You wish to do strength training, it's on YouTube. You wish to do relaxation, it's on YouTube, no problem. Or there is an app for it. How do you learn to make that possible for you? And how do you have a system that is going to work for you in the long run? Because what I have seen over 20, 25 years in this, and my parents have been in this for 50 years, and then their teachers before them, is that it's easy to do something for a short duration, but it's hard to do something that consistently leads you towards greater well-being and peace over, say, 5 years. And this is what you will also see. You do some style of yoga, it works for a while, then diminishing returns, you get stuck. And this happens again and again. Switch to a different style, learn something else, and then you get stuck. If you have a comprehensive map and you have a systematic approach to this that combines the ancient and the modern, you will find that you don't fall by the wayside. 5 years from now, you're better off from you were now, deliberately and confidently. 10 years from now, you'll be much better off than you were 5 years, and so on. Lifelong well-being. So I will stop with this and leave it open to questions.
Thank you, Ganeshji, for that wonderful presentation and also giving us that map, various domains of well-being, and also charting it with how the Ashtanga Yoga approach takes care of those various domains, even in the subtle areas. I think that was one of the best messages that we got in this session, to see, have this laid out in one canvas in front of us.
Thank you, Ganesh Chandra. That was the idea. I have presented that domains about 30, 40 times to different groups over the last couple of years, refining it and trying to see. There's no map that's perfect. It's important to keep that in mind. We can only aim for what is useful. Like Patanjali presents the 8 limbs of yoga. Maybe he could have presented 9 limbs if he really wanted to, but I mean, he knew what he was doing there. And that 8 limbs has a certain consistency. Once you enter that map, you see that there is great depth behind how all the pieces fit together. We have so much to say from an ancient perspective about this holistic and integrated approach to well-being, which we are struggling with in modern times because we are starting with the pieces and then we are expecting something holistic to come out of it suddenly somewhere. But it doesn't work that way. You need to first look at the whole and then see the pieces also. You need to come the other way.
True. So we have a few questions. So before I take up the questions, I also would like to ask you about, see, there is a particular way of looking at things in the tradition, what we see in the Sankhya framework, which actually is also basis for yoga, and a particular approach in the modern style, I mean, modern studies. You are familiar with both the perspectives. How do they complement each other, or are they at conflict? How do we reconcile them? Any suggestions, any thoughts on that?
That is such a broad question, but I understand the intent behind the question.
And especially this subjective nature of looking into things. The whole darshanas look into the subjective world, subjective experience. And science today goes more towards in an objective exploration of things.
Actually, this question, does reality exist outside of me? Modern science also completely agrees that there is no way to prove that. In fact, there's a lovely YouTube video, very entertaining on this, from the science channel called Vsauce, Vsauce. It's a nice science channel, great for kids also, and nice for adults, where he takes up this question, does the world exist? The answer is we actually cannot say, because all you have is your subjective experience of the world. There is no denying that. What we call objective is what you and I agree upon. If we all agree upon the same experience, we say it is objective. For instance, you take this air conditioning remote here, we say this is white in color. There is no such thing as color. Color is only a subjective experience. There only exist wavelengths of light. Red, blue, and green are entirely generated from within your brain. What is it like to be a dolphin? Hey, you will never know. A dolphin has a different subjective experience of the world. Objective is also important. And the Shastras, the traditional texts, are not saying that each person's subjective experience is completely different and therefore you cannot provide any guidelines. Not at all. They are saying that there is commonality of experience. This is why Nyaya also says, among these 7 categories, there is Samanya and Vishesha. Samanya is that there are commonalities, categories, and also Vishesha, which is specificity. In fact, you find this even in object-oriented programming 20, 30 years ago when you looked at computer science, that you have instances of objects. You have a class called a chair. Chairs in general, for example, have 4 legs and they have a seat. But each chair can be different. It can have unique capacities, or unique qualities. Sankhya follows this. It takes a map of 25 pieces, 24 plus 1 actually, which form our experience, and it breaks them down and gives the specific characteristics, the asadharana lakshana, the specific characteristic of each, and the common characteristics among them. So this is also equally scientific, actually. There is nothing in this presentation that is at odds with what we are doing in modern science. It's purely a question of what we are examining. What qualities and variables are you examining? Modern psychology actually examines the same variables that we have been examining in yoga, Vedanta, Buddhism for the past 3,000 years. Because you can't examine an emotion like love by looking at a molecule in the brain. That's why the molecule in the brain is part of the hardware, of the substrate. But the emotion is not the molecule. Emotion is the experience that arises from a lot of interactions. The molecule is also part of it, that is all. We need to understand that when we do yoga research, for example, we do breathing techniques and then we say there are some changes in the waves in your brain. This requires some careful interpretation, because what is the clinical value of that finding? What does it mean to say that my EEG in my brain has changed? For example, if you do left nostril breathing or right nostril breathing, it actually does have a differential impact on the 2 sides of the brain. What does this mean? We don't know. But generally, it is true that you have cyclicity in this is called the nasal cycle. Sometimes one nostril is more open, at other times the other nostril is more open, and we cycle through this physiologically. And automatically there is sidedness in the function of the brain. Because now if I do Surya Vedana or Chandra Vedana, there is a certain paradigm to analyzing this from the Ayurveda perspective as heating and cooling. From a modern perspective, if I say that some neurotransmitter in the brain has changed, that's interesting, no doubt, it's a finding. But what are we supposed to do with that finding? Because the neurotransmitters in your brain are changing all the time, no matter what you do. When I'm talking to you, lots of genes are being turned on and off all the time. When you exercise, any exercise apparently turns on and off something like 1,000 genes. There was a very interesting study on this earlier this year. What does it mean to pick a few changes and then say, we found this? I'm not sure that really validates anything about the practice, because the experience of the person is actually the outcome you're expecting. If that experience of the person is irrevocably and directly tied to some kind of biochemical change, then that marker, that biochemical change, is very useful to measure. But if the connections are vague, that a lot of biochemical changes are happening in the body, when you do breathing, that's often the case. Lots of changes are happening in your body. Breathing impacts every body system. Your immunity is going to change, your hormonal markers are going to change, genes are going to turn on and off. Measuring those parameters is something that should be taken somewhat cautiously as evidence of yoga works. I'm not saying it's not useful. What I'm trying to say is it's not necessary to justify yoga working like that, because that is not the outcome you're looking for in any case. The outcome you're looking for is actually the transformation in how the person feels. That's the parameter that should be measured. Unless you're able to show that a particular biochemical change or a molecular change is strongly tied to a certain change at the higher emergent levels of thought and emotion and behavior, measuring that parameter is not particularly helpful. It's just one among a lot of parameters. So it's just we need to choose our research targets effectively in a way that reflects the complexity of the problem and the complexity of the intervention. When the intervention changes 30 variables at the same time, you can't reduce it to measuring a few variables. That measurement is not clinically useful, finally. It's an interesting finding, and sometimes that interesting finding throws light on the clinical outcome. It tells you some correlations. Sometimes it doesn't. I sometimes feel, we are chasing validation in certain ways because we are stuck in certain research systems that have their own momentum. the publish or perish, some of these. I'm not casting a broad net saying that research is not useful at all. I mean, there's lots of research I find sometimes that is like really interesting. For example, there was a very interesting study from a team in Italy that did this. They tried to separate the component of awareness, mindfulness, and meditation from the pressure in the nostrils during pranayama practice. Because usually when we do pranayama practice, you can't separate the attention component. You're paying attention to the breath, you're calming down, you're doing all those things. So what they did was they put plugs in the nose and then a little cannula, a little opening through that plug. They put a little tube in and then they physically blew air in to manipulate the pressure in the nose. And they just let the person lie down on their back and just forget about focusing, nothing. So it's a purely mechanical effect, just the pressure in the nose. And that itself changes a lot of the brain patterns. It creates synchronicity in the brain waves. This is called entrainment of the brain waves. So we have discovered a very interesting mechanism here by which pranayama actually works. That the mechanoceptors in the nose, in some way or the other, are linked to the entrainment of the brain functions. It creates a synchronicity in the brain waves that goes along with the synchronicity of the pressure changes in the nose. That is really interesting research. It tells us that pranayama works directly through the pressure in the nose also. So even if your client, your student is scattered, you know what, it's okay. Just get them started doing Nadi Shodhana pranayama. And we have strong physiological basis to suggest that it's going to start getting them to calm down. So yeah, there is a lot of research that's fantastic. But sometimes, we are chasing variables that they are not our variables as yoga teachers. They are molecules. You can influence them using a drug. You can't influence them directly using breath. So anyway, this is just a few thoughts.
I mean, that's the balance one needs to be careful about while not losing the holistic vision of yoga, yet trying to find out what is empirically validatable. I think that's
Absolutely.
what
What variables we need to measure, that is really important.
And also, I'd just like to connect with what you said about pranayama to one of the presentations we had a couple of days back by Stephen Parker, Somaji, who was a student of Veda Bharati in the Himalayan tradition. His session was on the secret of being an advanced practitioner, and where he answered this question in the form that the ultimate refinement of fundamental practices. And coming back to breathing, he said, this is the practice. If you have to bring about any sort of change, just focus on breath work, on pranayama, and that can do wonders and magic for you. And Swami Vedabharati did this till the last moment.
Oh,
so I think that's...
And Krishnamacharya also used to say that, my father keeps saying that Hatha Yoga is really pranayama. That's the heart of pranayama, which you understand if you read the Hatha Yoga Pradipika also. You realize that the whole practice is about creating this binding of the inner experience. And that's where the breath comes in. That's the link between going from asana to the deeper experiences of yoga. Ultimately, pranayama is about figuring out that I am not my body, that inner experience. So many interesting links.
So that brings us to our next question from Rajendran Ji, who says, could you please explain on Krishnamacharya's style of customizing yoga for every individual? We have heard about yoga. So would you like to elaborate on that? And also, personally, if I can add, did you have any personal experiences with Krishnamacharya Ji? And how was it?
As a child, yeah.
Okay.
As a child, my father used to take him to meet him and all that. I have many lovely impressions and memories of meeting him. Not as a student, of course. Yeah, I was too young at that time, and he wasn't teaching children in that stage of his life. He was 90 years old. And my impression of him really is presence. You would, when you see me talking, for example, I get absorbed in this speech, and then I'm moving my hands, I'm moving my head. That's the samskara, an expression of the inner impulse in my mind. That thoughts come up in my mind a little too much. But my entire impression of Krishnamacharya is that sense of stable presence, that you would not see him waving his hands about, you would not see him shaking his head in any other way. When he speaks to you, it is with this complete attention, focus, that where he is at that time. That is 85 years of meditation by the time I saw him. See, Krishnamacharya's principle is actually a Vedic principle that everything needs to be adapted to stages of life, for example. That is the general idea that you find this in the ancient texts, that all living beings go through this cycle, that the potential exists and then the seed sprouts and then it becomes a tree and then the tree grows and then it bears fruit and then it decays and it dies and the cycle happens throughout. And we need to adapt our practices to the stage of life of the person, to the health and well-being, to the capacities of the person. Please remember that he used whatever tools he had at his disposal. He was a master in several areas, not so much in some areas. For example, he was not an Ayurvedic physician full-time, which is why, see, my father studied with Krishnamacharya until 1989. That was about 19 years. And after he passed away, he studied for another 30 years. So actually, studying with Krishnamacharya is probably around 1/3 of his studies. It's one thing to have a personal guru, which was Krishnamacharya to him. It's something else to learn the subject. My father went on to study Ayurveda in detail when I was studying it also. We studied one of the former principals of the Ayurveda college here because he was he was also later principal of the Sanskrit college. He was a Vedic Ghanapati, a Pandit, and also professor of Ayurveda. And he has his own in-depth insights, right, to offer in that space because he has seen thousands and thousands of patients, worked in that area, which was not Krishnamacharya's domain. He knew Ayurveda, but it was not his main focus, right? Yoga was his main focus. And similarly, you will see some of the Shaiva and Shakta Tantras, some of these areas were also not Krishnamacharya's preferred area. He was a Sri Vaishnavite, a very strong Sri Vaishnava Brahmin. That was his heart deeper inside, and that is the nature of Sri Vaishnavism. You cannot be divided. You cannot surrender to Vedanta Desika and Ramanuja and at the same time also have Shaiva and Shakta practices going on in the background. You must commit, and he was very much in that. So some of these other areas also my father went on to study with people who are experts in those areas. And then there is another very important source that everybody should study in yoga, which is Swami Hariharananda Aranya. He was the Sankhya yogi. It's very rare to find somebody who's a pure Sankhya yogi because yoga has been subsumed into Vedanta and all the branches historically. But to have pure Sankhya yoga as the foundation of explaining everything is very deep and important, also very useful. So we have spent a lot of time studying the works of Swami Hariharananda Aranya. He's quite well known. In fact, he wrote that commentary Bhaswati, which is a standard reference along with Vachaspati Mishra and Vijnana Bhikshu. It's a standard reference book for Patanjali Yoga Darshana. In fact, you study it when you study in Sanskrit college, you do your degree, for example. This is a standard textbook you would study. So we spent a lot of time looking into that. Descriptions of Jnana Yoga, for example. Krishnamacharya, for example, was very much into Bhakti Yoga. That was his foundation. Jnana Yoga is a little bit different. If you see, for example, Ramana Maharishi's description, I'm not my body, I'm not my senses, I'm not my mind. That is what Sankhya describes. Nasmi name naham. So you have to pick up all the modalities you have at your disposal. Krishnamacharya gave us the principle. That is the key thing. See the person where they are. And he gave us many wonderful tools, which a lot of you are learning now. For example, even combining breathing with movement was one of his foundational principles, which I don't think other yoga schools in that time emphasized to that degree. To him, that was like a central pillar. Start the breath, then the movement, always. A lot of these principles, looking at how Hatha Yoga connects to Raja Yoga and how this can be done in a Vedic way, he has really explained in a way that we should be profoundly grateful for. It's very difficult to find other sources for that. So if you see what would Krishnamacharya do, he was using the map that he had, the skills that he had at his disposal to look at the person and offer suggestions. We should expand on it. We should take that vision and add whatever we need to it. And we have the great gift that we are standing on the shoulders of giants. right? Krishnamacharya has given us all of this. It's not about singing Krishnamacharya's praises. Honoring him is really taking his vision forward. He died 30 years ago, but why is his teaching expanding more and more? He never left the shores of India, but people, literally like tens of millions of people are practicing his principles now. He is alive in every single way that matters. I mean, Patanjali
And
is still alive.
and he himself kept on revising his own maps. What he taught earlier was much different, and what he taught later was quite a different one, I believe.
See, getting into some of this is a
Okay.
little bit tricky, but some things don't change. This much my father will say. In general, some things don't change. Emphasis on breathing, practices that lead towards inner awareness, getting towards the bandhas in Hatha Yoga gradually, combining bhakti and the divine with this, sticking to the shastras, the traditional ways of presentation. These things never changed in his practice. It's more that, yes, of course, he grew also, no doubt, somebody of his intelligence and caliber, as he continued to teach, without a doubt, he would have continued to refine what he was doing. But the basic principles don't actually change all that much. But his life went through many stages, right? He was in colonial India in that time, and they had to prove it to the British, and that is why the propaganda, he used to always go on about this. And then, so the extreme demonstrations, you can see his video on YouTube in 1938. He never did some of those things again. He did it to show that, hey, look, we can do this. His personal practice was not actually so extreme. It's fascinating to see the trajectory of some of those developments now that we can look back at them from a distance. But the foundations of his teaching really did not change. 2010, I worked with my parents extensively to write this book, Krishnamacharya. At that time, we wanted to include a lot more notes. My father has something like 5,000 pages of notes from Krishnamacharya's teaching. He just wrote everything at that time because he was young. He said, I don't know whether I will understand this now. I will understand it at some time later, which has been really helpful. We've been going through that, like doing repeated cycles of looking into Krishnamacharya's teaching. That's one of the programs we want to put out there, the Hatha Yoga of Krishnamacharya. How does Hatha Yoga link up to Raja Yoga, and what are some of the key principles that he brought about? And because his teaching have also taken many paths, and it would be good to take a look at what did he actually say and try and understand that. This has been one of my personal quests, that's all. It's not a question of what is right and wrong or nothing like that. We're all doing useful work, but it's always good to revisit, look at, deepen.
So thank you very much for spreading light on some unknown facets of the development of yoga's history, and sharing it candidly with us. We have a couple of practical questions.
Yes.
We have one from Deepika ji, and also same question is repeated by someone else, also has not mentioned their name. Says, what do you do, or when do you feel lazy? How do you motivate yourself? Because you mentioned about intrinsic, extrinsic factors of motivation also. You mentioned it in the presentation. So how can one motivate oneself? How can one overcome the antaraya, which is also listed in the Yoga Sutra, the alasya?
Yes, actually there are two related antarayas mentioned there. One is Sthana and the other is alasya. You can be very rajasic, so restless that we are kind of paralyzed. That also happens. And we can also feel very dull, and therefore we don't practice. Take it small. This number 3 is the key. You see in the screen share here. I will refer you to a little modern website that is quite nice in this. It's called tinyhabits.com. TINY, tinyhabits.com. I think it's from the Stanford Behavioral Lab. It's a lovely example which I like to give in the trainings. So he gives this suggestion. Suppose you want to go jogging every morning. This is the first thing you do is start with the smallest step that you can sustain. And that might be just putting your shoes beside your bed. That's it. So you wake up in the morning, you're walking around, you're looking at your shoes. 1 week goes by, and then you start wearing your shoes and then walking around. Of course, he's in the West, wearing the shoes inside the house. You can use a different set of shoes if you're in India, because we don't like to do that. And then after another 1 week goes by and you're wearing your shoes anyway, so you step outside and then you walk around in your flat complex or in your garden a little bit. And then another 1 or 2 weeks goes by and then you're walking for longer distances. And then you're anyway outside, so you decide to jog for a minute or so. Take it very small. Vyasa and Swami Hariharananda point this out. You have the Klishta Vrittis and the Aklishta Vrittis. Yeah? The Klishta Vrittis and the Aklishta Vrittis are opposed to each other. The Kleshas are the negative tendencies like ego, desire, fear, and so on. We have activities of the mind based on them, and we also have the opposites. Love, joy, compassion, the positive, and all the 8 limbs of yoga, the practices that we do. Every little bit that you do leaves behind a useful samskara. If you took some effort and did a little bit of walking today, that samskara is not gone. So Swami Hariharananda gives a little example like this. He says, imagine that all the klishta vrittis, the negative tendencies, are like a dark room, and there is a ray of light coming in, which is the positive change that you're making. That ray of light may be very small, but because the darkness is big, it doesn't mean that it overpowers the ray of light. They are intrinsically opposed to each other. So he's very encouraging. You know, Patanjali's definition of abhyasa is, Vyasa's definition is nirvrittika, prashantavahita, no vrittis, complete stillness of the mind. This is abhyasa, the effort that you make. That is very far away. But the commentary, Swami Hariharananda, is very encouraging. He says, any little step you take to be a little more sattvic, a little more calm, leaves behind the samskara. So it doesn't matter if you feel lazy, do the smallest practice you can. And you must enjoy it. That is Shraddha. The conviction in the practice comes not only from believing Patanjali, believing a teacher, believing me, believing somebody. It comes from your feeling. Abhiruchi mati nischaya vritti is what he says. Abhiruchi, like good food. You must enjoy it. So ask yourself, what do I enjoy in this practice? Maybe that is relaxation. When you're feeling lazy, good for you. Do a bit of relaxation and then do a little few joint rotations, do a little series like that for just a few minutes. Good. You have done something that day to be a little more sattvic. You're on your way to better yoga. Is that not beautiful? So easy. Little steps. Abhiruchi mati nischaya vritti. You must feel that, hey, I can do this and it must feel good for you. That's where the teacher helps, of course. The teacher is a guide trying to help us to find these things.
I think this is the most helpful tip, that to be able to find that rasa, that taste, abhiruchi, as you said, and that can be the highest or the strongest intrinsic motivator.
Absolutely. And this is not me. This is Swami Hariharananda. This is the wisdom of the ancients that I'm giving you here. So wonderful.
And this idea gets repeated even in Gita, rasam drishtva, like once you have that rasa, you don't want to go to other things. I think bringing this idea, I think it's very, very powerful.
Absolutely. Yes. You find that so many times in the Gita also. That is why. And that's why Triambakam yajamahe sugandhim pushtivardhanam urvarukamiva bandhanan mrityor mukshi yamamritaat. Like this bandhana, you know, the famous mantra, the Mrityunjaya mantra. This bandhana, this bondage must fall away like I'm ripe, like a ripe fruit drops away. Why? Because you have found what you really want. Like that, I feel dull and I feel lazy. And then you do a little bit of joint rotation, some comfortable breathing, and you say, oh, this feels good. Enjoy that. And then tomorrow you will see it's easier to come back to that because you have found something better, greater through the practice. That rasa, as you say, so important. Bhagavad Gita also says that beautifully.
Yeah, thank you very much. We also have a question from Julian. She's referring to your words on the Ishvara Pranidhana, Tapaswadhyaya, and Ishvara Pranidhana, the Kriya Yoga aspect. So can you give examples for tapas? You mentioned it. So some practices and what could tapas constitute?
Tapas is not a practice. It's very important to understand this. We often think sweat it out, that is tapas, because the root meaning of the word tapas, tapasantape, comes from to heat. So nowadays is marketing. You do hot yoga, you do exercise, you sweat it out. I'm doing tapas. No. This is deep psychology here. What Vyasa says is anadi karma klesha vasana chitra pratyupasthita vishayajala cha ashuddhihi na antarena tapasaha sambhedamapadyata iti. You have the samskaras inside of us, and then they're constantly being pulled out in the form of activity by the senses. I must eat this, I must see this, I must do that, I must answer that phone call, I must type this email out, I must sit down and think about it and worry about it. Instead of staying calm, staying present, because all the practices of yoga require us to step away from those impulses. Whether it's asana, pranayama, dharana, dhyana, samadhi, whatever we are doing, yamas or niyamas, the impulse to speak a harsh word because I'm a little irritated. If I don't speak that harsh word, instead I say a mantra and I stay calm, I am now practicing mantra meditation, which is also swadhyaya. I am practicing the yama, ahimsa, both of these. But where is the tapas here? The tapas is that forbearance, that capacity to tolerate that resistance, that the mind says, okay, say that. They say, no, 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 no. Pause. That is tapas. That is why Vyasa says that na antarena tapasaha sambhedam apadyata iti. Without tapas, this bondage of constant restlessness activity, which is preventing us from progressing deeper towards stillness and peace, that bondage cannot be cut. You have to tolerate that little bit of discomfort, but not blindly. He himself cautions that don't do blind fasting, for example. We have Kritra and Chandrayana in the Vedic systems where you fast with the moon cycle. But Vyasa says, be cautious. If your health is not up to it, then don't do that. Don't do it blindly. That is, it should not be suppression. There is no suppression in yoga, always. Always mindfulness. Find an intelligent pathway. That is why Swadhyaya immediately follows tapas. You must have self-reflection, study, and guidance. That I'm not simply forcing myself to exercise every morning. I do asana for 1 hour, whether I feel good or whether I feel bad. Am I being sattvic through this practice? That wisdom must be there. And if the practice is making me sattvic, I must tolerate some resistance. That is tapas. It's actually part of all the practices that you do. Every time you face some resistance and you say, breathe in and then say, no, I'm going to sit for another few minutes in meditation. I'm going to continue my pranayama for a little more. In this situation, it's very tempting for me to tell a lie, but no, I won't. I will say the truth. All of these make us more sattvic inside. We become calm. And think about it. If you decide to lie in some situation, where does it end? Yoga Sutra is not telling us the yamas like some 10 commandments, like moral injunctions. You know, if you lie, somebody will punish you. No, nothing like that. It says if you start lying, it never ends. In any situation, see, if I can't start telling you some story about Krishnamacharya said this to my father and then suddenly something happened, you know, I start telling you stories like this, where will that end? I can keep making up more stories, right? But what will happen to my state of mind? No chittavritti nirodha, no sattva. Because in every situation, there might be a better lie, if only you try to lie better. And the moment you abandon that boundary, that is why it is called yama, a limit. The moment you abandon that limit, you are lost. There is no possibility of sattva and chittavritti nirodha. So we do this for ourselves. And of course, the mind will say, why don't you just lie? It's a white lie. Just go tell him that. It's okay. How is he going to know? Watch out. See, is it ahimsa? Is it going to hurt somebody? Is this going to leave me feeling more sattvic? And sometimes the mind will protest, push back against that. That is tapas. It's part of every yoga practice that you do.
And it easily fits back to what you had showed us earlier on the domains of well-being, relationships and boundaries, which is one of the important factors for well-being. So that's where it again comes back.
Absolutely. So important, right? I mean, all changes happen within some relationship. In the Bhagavata, for example, has this beautiful description of how all of nature can be a guru. A guru is an embodiment of the transformation that you wish to see. That really is one part of being a guru, and the other is the wisdom and the teachings. There has to be a system. Just being in the presence of somebody alone is not enough. You have to do the work of changing yourself, and that's why Patanjali didn't just simply sit in front of his students. He wrote the Yoga Sutra, gave it to us.
So moving on to the next question from Dr. Jaiprakash Gupta ji. I think he's joining from Sydney. He is asking about the hard problem of consciousness that we come across in the modern science. How does the Vedic yogic tradition view it? Do we also have this hard problem of consciousness?
We don't. This is, see, currently we have a platform called yogaknowledge.net, which has been running for nearly 8 years now. It's not that I'm advertising it, but then this is something I feel strongly about. Traditional studies have to be ongoing. We try and package something like studying the Yoga Sutra. If you pick up the Yoga Sutra in bits and pieces from 5 different people, one weekend here, one weekend there, you never really appreciate the depth of the presentation. You have to study Vyasa, Swami Hariharananda, sit with a traditional source like that, and then let it grow deeper and deeper for the insights to emerge. I'm presenting the Sankhya Karika word by word, verse by verse, word by word now on that platform, looking at Vachaspati Mishra and Swami Hariharananda's commentaries in the background. The basic difference between Buddhism and the Vedic philosophies like Sankhya is this question of whether consciousness exists or not. This is a very tricky thing because what we understand by the statement consciousness is often confused. What Sankhya is talking about in yoga is consciousness, is not identity. That is quite different from the Western perspective, and often in Abrahamic religions, when you talk about a soul, it hews closer to something like identity, whereas in our Eastern philosophies, consciousness is more like the root of existence. Satta matra is the basic idea here. The root, this is how Sankhya views it, that ultimately at the root of everything, there is the basal existence. That is unavoidable in some form. Buddhism tries to get around this by their own arguments, trying to say that there is some continuity that exists because they also accept rebirth philosophically, and so there has to be some continuity of existence. This is the hard problem philosophically. How do you talk about continuity of existence? But otherwise, actually, mostly all the Eastern philosophies are 99% the same. Yoga, Vedanta, Buddhism, they're all almost entirely the same. Everybody accepts the 8 limbs of yoga, everybody accepts samadhi, everybody accepts this need to be still. The hard problem of consciousness is, from a modern scientific perspective, a real challenge. Artificial intelligence is developing now. Pattern matching can be done extremely well using our current neural networks, convolutional neural networks. And then if you have this adversarial neural networks, which enable self-learning, I mean, you can go look it up. Pretty interesting stuff. And that is how, for example, you can teach a program to learn a game by itself. Artificial intelligence, for example, can learn computer games by itself by playing against itself. It uses the basic same structure of the neural networks of the brain, but the brain is vastly more complicated and we don't really understand what's happening. And what artificial intelligence does right now is probably not the same thing. It doesn't learn in the same way that the brain does. For example, to recognize a cat, like Facebook can tag your pictures, it can recognize your cat, and even your iPhone can now. But you need to feed it like 1,000,000 images of a cat. But a baby doesn't need to see 1,000,000 cats before it realizes what a cat is. The Samanya, what category is a cat. So we don't really understand, in one sense, even what intelligence per se is. Is intelligence just pattern matching? Because that is what artificial intelligence essentially does now. It does heuristic pattern matching in a self-learning way. And it's a black box. We don't know what the network actually is doing inside. It's a huge topic which I have a lot of interest in discussing with my friends, certain people who are in this field. The hard problem of consciousness is a very tricky thing if you think of consciousness as an emergent phenomenon, which is how modern medicine views it.
Very true.
If you look at Christoph Koch, for example, and his views, it's that if you reach a certain degree of complexity of organization, then consciousness automatically emerges. So everything is conscious to some degree. It's a form of modern scientific pantheism. Consciousness exists in everything to some degree. It's an interesting perspective, but it's a discussion for a different topic.
I'd just like to repeat, Ganeshji referred to the web portal where they're offering various kinds of courses. It's yogaknowledge.net. I have shared it in the chat box. You can see there are specific courses designed, and please, you can make the most of the courses that are available. For over many years, they have put efforts to develop and offer these courses, and they're all available to us now. Anything that you want to say about the courses and the programs there, Ganeshji?
It's free for a month. The first month is free. Just go take a trial. And I mean, I hope a lot more people sit with these studies for longer, really. My father has gone through the whole Yoga Sutra, the first and second chapters in detail with Vyasa's commentary. And you access all the 8 years, whatever was there over all the 8 years, you get access to the moment you go in. Because studying the Yoga Sutra is never linear. You keep studying, you know that absolutely well. You keep studying, and things spark depending on the time of your life, other things that you heard, and so on. That's the beauty. You and I are not in these states of mind, these deep meditational states of mind. We can't describe them with the kind of clarity and the philosophy and psychology that emerges from it. It's not a survey and a hypothesis that Patanjali did and then figured out something. So
This
really,
is one theme that is emerging, Ganesh ji, in most of the presentations, like one common theme, that the need to go back to the original sources, the need to connect with those texts and the writings, and also invest oneself with knowing a little bit of Sanskrit, little bit into the actual text, and trying to understand the classical tradition. And then one can always experiment and can also have a very modern perspective, try to experiment. But all things are possible. First, to have that connection with the original source. I think this is coming again and again.
important. See, there's a lovely paper, for example, connecting the 3 gunas to the polyvagal theory. Very nice, but that's not what the 3 gunas are at their foundation. That's one aspect of the 3 gunas. You can connect modern polyvagal theory to the 3 gunas, for example. Excellent. But the 3 gunas are not a foundation in Buddhism, but they are in yoga. And that's something very important to realize why. That has to do with how yoga views existence, the continuity of existence, and that there are 3 basic gunas, 3 qualities that have to be present in all animate organisms. One is existence and perception. The other is activity. The third is patterns. Without this, you cannot have a living organism. This is sattva, rajas, and tamas. Very interesting and very deep. If you read, for example, Michael Pollan's book on how to change your mind, it's about psychedelics and the LSD, psilocybin. There's a lot of interest in that, which can give you mystic experiences. The 4th chapter of the Yoga Sutra actually begins by saying this: Janma Oshadhi Mantra Tapas Samadhijaha Siddhayaha. These special experiences can come about through Oshadhi, herbs also. But Tatra Dhyanajam Anashayam, if you don't do it through meditation, you don't control it. So you don't really know where it's going to land up. Which is why the modern approach to these psychedelics and therapy is much more sensible than it was, say, 30, 40 years ago. You have a therapist in the room, you have a framing, you have follow-up sessions. You try and make sure that the experience is stable and controlled throughout. It can be very, very helpful. Where he takes up this organization of disorders, mental disorders, one way of classifying them dimensionally is those that have more chaos in the brain and those that have more stuckness in the brain. For example, depression and addictions tend to have the brain wiring more stuck. When you give these people some of these psychedelics, very surprising results sometimes. What you see under the scanner is that parts of the brain that are normally not talking to each other are now firing. That's why you have all sorts of strange experiences that normally the brain gates. It doesn't allow it to happen. There is more entropy, other words, chaos in the brain. But if you have schizophrenia, a tendency towards psychosis, all these are spectrum. Don't take these diagnoses like somebody is a schizophrenic. We are all schizophrenic to some degree. We are all depressed to some degree. It's just all patterns. If you have something like psychosis, there is already too much cross-firing in the brain. You're seeing or hearing things that you probably should not preferably be doing so. You give that person the same psychedelic and it might actually destabilize them more. This is an interesting point. You can think of one of these as an expression of being more tamasic, more stuck in patterns, which is why depression and addictions from a yoga lens tend to fall under more of a tamasic angle. Whereas these, which have more activity, anxiety and psychosis and all of these, are more rajasic. Very interesting connections from a traditional perspective. Fascinating.
Yeah. Thank you, Ganesh ji, for this fascinating session. In fact, in each one of the responses that you're giving, there's one more whole line of thought that is being triggered.
Right? I love these
Just you
discussions.
mentioned about the patterns. I mean, the way Patanjali looks at everything in terms of patterns when he uses vrittis and kleshas. I mean,
Yes,
it's
that
so
is why
amazing.
Vyasa starts. Chitta Bhumi, first sutra, change the ground of your mind. There's a lovely book on this in modern science, by the way, by Richard Davidson and Daniel Goleman called Altered Traits. How much meditation does it take to create a permanent change in your mind? How many hours of meditation does it take to create a permanent change in your mind? This is what Vyasa asks. 5
Hmm.
grounds of the mind. You're a yogi only if the habitual state of your mind is focused. You and I temporarily focused is vikshipta. We're not yogis. Ekagra bhumi is when you are always
The
calm.
first stage.
That is the fourth stage actually, is that kshipta, vikshipta, shipta, moda, vikshipta. The first 3 stages are sometimes focused. You can have focus in any state of mind.
True.
If I'm willing to hit somebody also, I can be focused. That is rajasic. But can I be habitually, calmly focused? Always. That
Hmm.
is change in samskara, the patterns. That is yoga. Oh, anyway, we could keep going on and on. So
Yes.
let's.
So with this, I would like to make the announcements for the evening and again get back to you for 2 things. One, how can people reach out to you? You have mentioned the website. Are there any other ways they can follow your work and connect with you? And secondly, one last parting message for the session that you would like to share with all our participants.
Keep studying.
Yeah. So I'll just make the announcements and come back to you.
Thank you,
Shivaji,
Ganesh. Thank you so much. Thank you.
so we just heard a master speaking, and in the evening we have a maestro coming in on Dhrupad and Nada Yoga Sadhana. So we have a session on Nada Yoga and Dhrupad Sadhana with Dhrupad maestro, vocal musician and maestro Sri Umakant Gundecha ji and Tarakini ji, who is a consultant and trainer in education and music, and she's also the co-founder of Sunag. They both will be in conversation for this lovely, lovely session on Nada Yoga and Drupad Sadhana. So kindly join us for this session and see you all in the evening again. And now I come back to Ganesh ji for a message that you'd like to share with all the participants.
I'm not so great a person that I have, in that sense, a message, more a messenger than anything else. So I would just offer gratitude and a chant. Let's all keep studying, keep learning, keep growing. That's the most important thing. And I'm very grateful to you and all of the team for really making this happen. I almost never present outside of Swastha's own channel, my own yoga school's channels. But the value system and what you're doing here is the motivation really to be part of this. So thank you so much. We will conclude again with Sahana Bhavatu, the same peace chant.
How can people follow your work, Ganesh ji? One is
Uh,
these two
Simplest thing is
websites.
just to look at the website. We have nice little online pranayama program with my parents actually that is ongoing now. At online.swastha.net. The other programs are at swastha.net. There are programs all around the world with a lot of our teachers. Which, my goal in general is to help people develop expertise. Yeah. It's not about me being the teacher. It's good if I'm in the background and teaching what I can help with. And I collaborate a lot with people who really have expertise in their areas. That's really important. And nobody knows everything. It's kind of silly. Um, we do what we can, each one of us. And my goal is to provide a platform in one sense to help all of us do better. So let's conclude with the peace chant again.
Just because some participants are asking, I want to let them know that yes, this video will be available online on Indica Yoga YouTube channel, Indica Yoga website, and Indica Yoga FB page. All the sessions that we have conducted so far are also available. So if you have not watched them, or if you want to revisit any of these videos, and especially this particular session, it was many sessions packed into one. So we would definitely want to go back and revisit and just mull over what we heard. And so please fall back on the videos that are available and make the most of it. So thank you once again. And I'll go back to Ganesh ji for the concluding prayer.
Oh. सहनाववतु सहनौ भुनक्तु सह वीर्यं करवावहै तेजस्विनावधीतमस्तु मा विद्विषावहै ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः
Thank you.